Hello, hello. I'm Sinner, and today I'm not doing a book review. I'm talking about a particular archetype that I've come across, and I've come across it for a long time in my life. Um, but I want to talk about it because I was reminded of it by a YouTube channel called Jimmy the Giant. Now, Jimmy the Giant is a YouTuber who does like cultural stuff. He talks about British subcultures. He did parkour. That's when I started watching him because I was into parkour as a kid. Then he went into subculture stuff, and now he's into politics. And it's interesting because Jimmy the Giant posted a video where he sort of goes on to talk about how he went from a sort of right wing MAGA type guy, you know, a libertarian, and fell into, um, not fell into, but he changed his mind and became a left winger. I find it funny that he labeled it, how I escaped the alt-right pipeline, because you see this a lot. I think Adam something made up another video that was like, I escaped the alt-right pipeline. And in both cases, neither of them were even close to being alt-right. But that's a different story. That term gets thrown around a lot as like a pejorative, but people don't really know what alt-right means. But either way, Jimmy the Giant, I think he's interesting because he's a archetype or a stereotype that I've seen a lot in my life. When I was in school, high school, there was this guy. Let's call him Mr. V. Mr. V was more right wing than Jimmy the Giant. He was genuinely a racist. He was genuinely a sexist. Very economically right wing. And I remember that maybe over the course of like half a year to a year, he basically started to flip on all of his beliefs. And he was pro MAGA and all this sort of stuff. I mean, we were in high school, but that was like 2016, I think, when I was, I was like the end of middle school in 2016. Um, but yeah, and I remember I was hanging out with him once we both had graduated, and we were like debating all these topics, or discussing, not debating. And he had done this 180, and I thought it was really interesting. And other kids in my school had also, guys mainly, had also done this 180. They had gone from being like MAGA guys, right wing conservatives, who would watch that guy who sat on the table with the coffee, the Change My Mind guy, Steven Crowder. And um, they would like be all into that sort of stuff. And then they would transition into being left wingers. And I think it's interesting because it points out two unique things about politics in Western English speaking countries. One is that the mainstream right is anti intellectual and um, reactionary, right? The mainstream right, as it stands today, doesn't actually really stand for anything as much as it stands against the left, right? If you watch Ben Shapiro or Jordan Peterson or any of these guys, I think Jordan Peterson, like I watched his biblical series when I was younger. He had some interesting things to talk about, but nowadays with the politics of these guys, their whole thing is just being against the left. That's all they are. So there's no belief system there. There's no foundation. There's no intellectual um, foundation to anything they have. And I think you can dig into that. I think there's reasons for that. But one, the right, the mainstream right, is anti-intellectual and reactionary. They don't talk about theories. They don't give a positive worldview. They just argue against the left. Whereas the left it does have a positive worldview. Now, in its own way, because it's like if you look at critical race theory and all of these ideologies, when you get into it and you like dig down into it, it ends up being reactionary and anti-Western because it's all about deconstruction and elimination of hierarchies. So they're not building anything up, they're tearing things down. But at least they have an intellectual side to it. So what happens is guys who are they just get into politics, they watched Ben Shapiro own the libs, and then after they watched Ben Shapiro own the libs, they would then be like, "Ha, these MAGA guys are so smart. They're so cool. These right-wing libertarian guys are so, intelligent and wise or whatever." But they quickly realize, well, not quickly, but they eventually realize all of these guys don't really believe. They don't spread any sort of belief. They just sort of uh, argue against the left, right? And then what happens is, if you go on YouTube or you read most books, a lot of the intellectual side of politics is dominated by the left on YouTube, and on the internet in general. And also if you go into any bookshop and you go into the politics section, most of the books are written by left wingers. And most of the academia is left wing, which leads to more left wing content being produced and sort of suffocating any right wing intellectual ideas from spreading. And this leads a lot of guys who get into politics, they're sort of pseudo disillusioned, I think, with the right. And then they start trying to, they're interested. So they look at the intellectual content that's political on YouTube, and it's all left wing stuff. Or they go to the bookshelf, they go to the bookstore, and they start looking at all the different books on politics, and it's all left wing stuff. And then, or even anthropological stuff or whatever it is, even a lot of history stuff, it's left wing. And they read those books, and then they come to the conclusion, oh my gosh, it was all that right wing stuff was stupid from the get go, and I was just being tricked. And it's like not. I mean, I'm not even a conservative, I would say, in the sense of like the mainstream, but I think it's a failure of the mainstream right, because that's a pipeline that I think is the case. It happens where you get a guy who is a conservative reactionary. He then, through being a conservative reactionary, becomes interested in politics, and all the political analysis and intellectual stuff that's mainstream around people is left wing, and then they start consuming that content and become left wingers, right? And that's sort of like the MAGA to left wing pipeline. Now, a lot of these guys, I find they don't end up being like super woke, because typically, and this is the other issue, is it's typically a binary on mainly economic policy and the results of economics, right? So if you convince a guy who's, let's say, a MAGA guy or whatever, that, anarcho-capitalism isn't the go, it's not the best thing ever, they also typically start to shed off their social beliefs, because um, the they perceive politics as a right-left paradigm or spectrum. So, let's say, well, yeah, so it's like they mistakenly think that if the mainstream conservatives are wrong about economic policy, then surely they're also wrong about social policy. But yeah, it's quite a shame. And I think it's quite interesting, because I believe that these types of people are very open-minded people, and they're very humble people. They're very willing to change their mind on topics about politics, which politics is super divisive, and a lot of it's propagandistic, I guess you could say. It's a lot of stuff is mud throwing and not rage bait, but uh, inflammatory. So these people, probably the most likely people that you could turn to be actual right wingers. But in order to do that, you need to give them a ideology, and that's where you need good quality uh, content creators and resources to help you out. And in terms of ideology, I will say this: with the right wing, you have like that mainstream uh, MAGA or just general conservative or neocon people, Ben Shapiro, Tucker Carlson, whoever, the mainstream guys. And then none of them really, you won't learn an ideology from them, you won't learn a philosophy from them. So what happens is either they go left, the people who are interested, or the less, I don't know if it's a minority or majority actually, but the other alternative is to go into an esoteric ideology, right? Like the number of people who are NRX, the number of people who are hardcore libertarians, the number of people who are, uh, I don't know, monarchists. Monarchism is back somehow. All these sorts of things. All these like new right wing ideologies, they're far more niche, right? Like if you look at a channel like that's a monarchist, like I don't know, Lavada or Aristocratic Utensil, these guys they get like tens of thousands of views, right? Or if you look at Monsieur Z or Ubersoy, Ubersoy is, I guess you could say he's part of the NRX, but he's obviously his whole thing is right wing progressivism. These guys also get tens of thousands of views. They're not big channels, right? And if you compare that to people like Hassan or ContraPoints or Vosh or whoever, there's a lot of other channels out there who make way more money and rake in way more views, but there's no intellectualism. It's reactionary stuff. It's I can't believe the left did this week type of thing. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. I think over time, the intellectual right is growing, and the other intellectual right sphere is the Christian right wing sphere, which is split down between the Prots, the Catholics, and the Orthodox, right? And I'm a Protestant, which is fun, but yeah, I'd say that also has its own philosophical side to it, which is helping people have a philosophy that can be the bedrock of an ideology. So yeah, you're starting to see these changes in the right. But yeah, I just wanted to sort of go off and have a random tangent for a bit. Um, yeah, I think I've said all I've wanted to say. But yeah, thank you for listening. And I'm Sinner, and I'll see you in the next one.